Ladies and gentlemen, this is Euler's number. It is one of the most important mathematical constants. It is the base of natural logarithms and is used in practice, for example, in calculations of compound interest rates. But my objective today is not to talk about the application of this number, but rather about its size. Just like pi, Euler's number is irrational, meaning it is a non-repeating decimal. It has an infinite number of digits after the decimal point. And these numbers do not keep repeating, nor do they follow a specific pattern. What you are seeing are 10,000 digits of Euler's number, but I won't go deep into the mathematics. My focus is the brain. Did you know there are people who can recite this entire numerical sequence from memory? And moreover, could you also be able to memorize all of this by learning a memory technique? If I were you, I would continue watching to understand how this technique works, and click subscribe.
Hey, Pedro here. This video you are watching was originally in Portuguese, my native language. This is the attempt of our team to translate it to English, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Your feedback is extremely important to us. Now, back to the video.
Before learning how to memorize a new sequence of thousands of numbers, we first need to understand what memory is and how it works. Memory is our brain's ability to store and recall information, and it all starts when a person receives some stimulus. For instance, when they read a text, or they listen to music, or watch a video like this one. At the moment this happens, including it happening to you now, our brain starts to act like a network. The information just arrived is converted into an electric impulse transmitted through this network, which is formed by nerve cells. Connections are made through synapses, which are points of proximity between neurons. Eventually, the information is finally stored in some part of the brain, depending on the type of memory. And it migrates to other places in our brain. The one who coordinates this entire system is the hippocampus, which is the gateway for starting storage. These memories return to the hippocampus whenever we want to remember something, or when people don't want to remember. Think about the next time you find yourself thinking about those embarrassing moments before going to sleep. In short, there are many classifications of types of memory, but there are two major groups that are most important for this video: short-term and long-term. Short-term memory is the one that lasts only a few seconds or minutes, a few hours. It is responsible for storing a phone number that you will need to call shortly and that you can forget soon after. Short-term memory also ensures you will remember a sentence you just read in a text before moving on to the next sentence, and that is why it is fundamental for day-to-day cognitive tasks. On the other hand, there are long-term memories. They can last days, years, or even our entire life. Long-term memories can be episodic, storing episodes, specific events from our lives. It could be that dream trip, your 15th birthday party, or a day when you met your loved one. But notice along with these memories, there is an affective component, which is connected to how much this memory impacts and endures in our lives. And they can also be semantic, which is related to the meaning of things. It is thanks to this type of memory you know the meaning of words, gestures, signals, and everything basic for communicating and living in society. Moreover, if you still know the capitals of various countries or remember Bhaskara's formula, you should thank your semantic memories. And finally, long-term memories can be non-declarative. It's the kind of memory that we can't verbalize or teach to someone, but that we naturally store as we grow. It's the case with our motor memory. And you know the famous saying, doing something is like riding a bicycle? We never forget. It is thanks to non-declarative memories that we never forget. This shows that our memory goes far beyond what we can imagine at first. In fact, everything is memory. The human being only functions because they remember. You could say that if I remember, therefore I exist. But just as everything human can be defective and stop working, memory is no different. And perhaps the greatest example of this is the infamous Amnesia. Who hasn't seen a movie where a character gets hit on the head and then forgets everything about their life? This level of complete memory loss can happen in real life, but it's extremely rare. The most common thing when someone suffers an accident is forgetting events that happened minutes before or after the blow, depending on the intensity and the exact location of the impact. There are also some health problems affecting the memory function. But before talking about that, I want to give a warning. A video on YouTube is not for self-diagnosis. So if I mention a symptom you have, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a disease. If it's a persistent symptom disrupting your life, then see a doctor. Some diseases directly affect long-term memory. The most well-known example is Alzheimer's. Both advanced age and genetic predisposition, like obesity, diabetes, and high cholesterol, can put a person at risk of developing this disease, which primarily affects the cells of the hippocampus. And those with Alzheimer's can have various memories erased. The patient may not remember significant events from their life and may even fail to recognize their children. And in more advanced stages, Alzheimer can even affect non-declarative memory, which is responsible for motor coordination. And that is why in some cases, a person has motor problems that are very serious as well as dangerous to their health. Short-term memory can also face failures caused by health issues. This is the case with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. People with ADHD tend to forget instructions they receive in seconds. You read a page of a book and realize that you have forgotten everything you just read. Then, you need to read it again. This shows how our focus is also important to activate mechanisms involved in memory. Another problem associated with short-term memory is dyslexia, as the difficulty in storing phonological information can cause difficulties in reading. In other words, with everything I've presented, I hope you can see that a person can have problems with only one type of memory and not the other. Your short-term memory, for example, might not be that good, but your long-term memory can be incredible. That's why it's common for us to forget what we had for breakfast, but remember perfectly how the first day of school was. But that's where things get a bit more complex. Do we really remember what our first day of school was like? Our brain resorts, so to speak, to a certain poetic license when reconstructing the facts of our past. And with that, it creates memories that never happened, or that aren't quite accurate. The brain doesn't have the capacity to literally store everything we see or feel. So instead of storing 100% of the information, it only keeps the most important part, which is the essence of what happened. And this is maintained each time we recall that memory. And then, when it comes to remembering, it fills in the gaps based on the association with other memories, or on what we want to emphasize this time, we are telling it, and so on. In the case of the first day of school, for example, you probably remember who your teacher was, some of your classmates, or maybe a general image of the classroom. But the details of the room's decoration, the school supplies, and the dialogues you heard are partially recreated by your brain based on other memories from your life, or even on what you were told about that day. You have certainly been in other classrooms. You have watched movies that were shown at school. You have talked to people who attended the same class. And with that, your brain mixes a bit of reality with a bit of fiction to recreate the movie of your life in your mind. And that's why recognizing criminals solely through composite sketches is not accurate at all, in any way. The person who was a victim of a robbery, for example, might be certain about who the thief was, but unintentionally, they might be mixing the real memory with an imagined description, based on some news they saw another day, or some dream they had recently, or even some kind of prejudice. And as a result, innocent people can end up in jail. Another problem related to memory you have probably experienced is the so-called deja vu. The expression comes from French and means already seen. It's when you have the sensation you are living through a repeated scene. That impression what is happening has happened exactly the same way in the past. Neuroscience isn't sure why this happens. What we do know is that there is a flow of information between the temporal lobe, where the hippocampus coordinates the functioning of our memory, and the frontal lobe, which is in our forehead. Sometimes this flow can end up having inaccuracies about when that memory happened, giving the sensation of having already lived something new or very similar to one of our recollections. And there is also the lesser-known sibling of déjà vu, which is jamais vu, which means never seen. It is when we should treat something with familiarity, but it becomes something strange to us. An example of this is when we say a certain word so many times in succession that it stops making sense. And this can happen with basically any word. But what about when an imprecision in memory affects not just one person, but thousands of people who don't even know each other? Is it possible for so many people to have a kind of collective false memory? This is the phenomenon known as the Mandela effect, the concept created in 2010 by American researcher Fiona Broome. She was certain that the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, had died in prison in the 1980s. And according to her, several other people had the same perception. It turns out that at that time, Mandela was alive. And in the year of 2010, he even attended the World Cup closing ceremony. Between us, this might highlight the lack of knowledge that people from certain countries have about the history of the African continent. But aside from that detail, there are false collective memories. Many people think that Pikachu has a black-tipped tail. The Monopoly mascot wears a monocle. Famously in Brazil, many swear as kids watched Dragon Ball Z on TV Globinho in December, when it was interrupted by a news bulletin about the World Trade Center attack. Pause the video and comment here if you have any of these memories. It turns out none of them are true. All are real memories mixed with imagination. In the case of September 11th, TV Globo searched the archives and proved that the Dragon Ball story is nothing more than a collective mistake. The cartoon playing at that time was Mickey Mouse. Just as our brain mixes up memories when we think about our first day of school, it is likely to confuse, for example, the cartoons we watched in childhood. And if a person talks about something that happened at that moment, which you also experienced as a child, you might be influenced by it and think you remember because we like to be part of social groups. Deep down, you don't remember what you were watching on TV in 2001. But from hearing so many reports and knowing things you've experienced, your brain creates or accepts a memory that never existed. Okay, but then, what can we do to avoid confusion and improve our memory? Science tells us that getting good nights of sleep, having a balanced diet, and doing physical activities are fundamental for the proper functioning of our brain and consequently, our memory. But there are some specific tips depending on what you want to improve in your memory. If you always forget everyday objects, one tip is to keep these objects close to others that you use. If you always forget your wallet at home, leave it with the key to your house, as you will see your wallet and take it with you. This technique also works for daily activities. Suppose you always forget to take out the trash. The tip is to sleep with the trash thrown in your bed, and when you wake up you will remember to throw it away. That was a joke. Don't do it and say that I suggested it. But what if your problem is something else? For example, let's suppose you forget people's names. There is a solution. The tip in this case is to associate this new person with someone you already know with the same name. Let's suppose you met an Amanda and your grandmother is named Amanda. Imagine the two going out for ice cream. Or the two of them fighting with a lightsaber. The more bizarre the association, the easier to remember. Now, if you don't know anyone with that name, the tip is to associate unusual images with the sound of that name. But what if you want to memorize a huge sequence of items or maybe even numbers, like those thousands of digits I showed at the beginning of the video? To take your memory to that level, you need to resort to some much more advanced techniques. These techniques were actually even used by the Brazilian Mike Anthony, who entered the Guinness Book as the first person to memorize more than 10,000 digits of Euler's number. And what are these strategies used by him and other memorizers? One of the main techniques used to remember lists of tasks or objects is called the link system. It involves not thinking about all the items at once. You only need to remember the first one. Then, from there, you create an association with the second item. Then, the second item makes you remember the third, makes you remember the fourth, reminds you of the fifth, and so on. But pay attention. Just like with the proper names I mentioned a little while ago, the big trick to making this work is to create a visual association. In this case, it is necessary to connect what you need to remember to a place that you know well and that is already ingrained in your memory. This place will be called the memory palace. It could be your house, your school, or, I don't know, your workplace. The idea is based on imagining that you are walking through this place and visualizing the objects you want to remember at specific points in that environment. And the key thing, as I mentioned, is to imagine everything in a very bizarre and unusual way, making it unforgettable. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose you need to memorize a shopping list that includes meat, milk, eggs, pasta, soda, and napkins. First, you need to choose what your memory palace will be. So, let's imagine it's your house. You can start the tour in the living room. And then, to remember the meat, you can imagine a bull sitting on the sofa. And it is sitting next to a cow, and it will remind you of milk. You then go to the hallway, which is full of broken eggs scattered on the floor. And when you try to enter your room, the doorknob is soft, as if it were made of spaghetti. And then, when you open the door to your room, it's completely flooded with soda. The only way you have to dry it is by taking a piece of napkin from your pocket. Done! When you think of this surreal scenario, you've listed all the items on your shopping list. You could also just write the list on your phone, but it's fine. The fact is that the link system technique can expand to include hundreds of items, using your entire neighborhood as a memory palace. But this strategy is not suitable for memorizing sequences of numbers. In this case, the way to go is to use another technique, the major system. In this case, you will associate each number with a sound following a globally standardized table. This is the table here. Each digit corresponds to the sound of a consonant. 0, for example, corresponds to the sound of S, 1 corresponds to the sound of T or D. The 2 to the sound of N, the 3 is the sound of mum, and so on. Following this table, the word ball, for example, can be converted to 955. Then to memorize huge numbers, you just do the reverse procedure. Let's take the first decimal places of P, for example. 1, 4, 1, 5, 9, 2. You can divide them into blocks of 2, 3, or 4 numbers, whichever you prefer. In this case, 1, 4, 1 can become TRD, and then you can think of the word trade. Now 592 would be equivalent to LPN. And then you can remember lupine, as in wolf-like. And then you apply these words to a visual linking system. For example, you can imagine yourself at a trade with lupine creatures. And then you need to continue with this procedure for as many numbers as you want, creating a very strange mental image that helps you memorize a gigantic number. It may seem laborious, and it is. It can take you months to memorize thousands of numbers. But the fact is that this is the only way that has allowed someone to memorize, for example, the first 10,000 digits of Euler's number. You might be thinking that all of this is kind of useless, but these are ways for you to train your brain. Even though they do not seek a practical result, the important thing is to stimulate memory. It's the same idea as running on a treadmill. It obviously won't take you anywhere, but it will help improve your physical fitness. What I mean is that taking care of our mind is just as important as taking care of our body. And by using some of the techniques I brought in this video, I'm sure your brain will develop even more and in a memorable way. So if you liked this video, remember to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. And feel free to comment below on what else you would like to learn here so you never forget. Thank you very much and see you next time.